Ladd McConkey might be the most overrated receiver in Dynasty leagues right now. We'll explain why next.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Welcome back. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is our new co-host, Michael Fabiano. Make sure you follow him on Twitter at Michael_Fabiano. And on today's show, we're continuing to take a look at Fabs' Dynasty rankings compared to the current batch of ADP that we have from Dynasty League Football. And Fabs, I was looking at your wide receiver rankings this morning, and I noticed that Ladd McConkey is not a top 10 receiver, whereas over on Dynasty League Football, Ladd McConkey is not only a top 10 receiver, but the 15th overall player in startup drafts. Why are you lower than the consensus?
Well, first off, I love Ladd McConkey. I love him.
so
I affectionately call him Laddie Daddy. Last year,
I've got football cards right next to my desk. I love Ladd McConkey so much.
I love him. I loved him coming out of college. I loved where he landed, and he was sensational last season. He was better than I thought he would be. He was one of my favorite sleepers at wide receiver. But 10? That's high, man. I mean, like, I'm at 17, and I think that's pretty good. So, listen, there's guys like Jackson Smith and Jigba, AJ Brown, Marvin Harrison Jr., Garrett Wilson, all being drafted ahead of Laddie Daddy. I mean, I love. I'm not doing that, right? McConkey is a guy who people are hoping is what the next Julian Edelman type, right? So. And I love the kid. Now, he did have durability issues coming out of college. The Chargers did draft Trey Harris. Mm-hmm. And I'm guessing they're probably not done adding weapons to the offense over the course of the next couple of seasons because Quentin Johnson has been, well, let's just say, not very good. Also, if we look at Greg Romanson's offenses, how many wide receivers have actually been elite? Not many.
And I think it's only been Ladd. Honestly, I think Ladd has been the most productive receiver to Greg Roman offense.
In fact, maybe not. Right. Exactly. And he's not an elite type of wide receiver. We saw Anquan Bolden have some good numbers and Michael Crabtree have some good numbers, but not a top end, top 5 type of player. It just doesn't happen. And so, again, I love McConkey. I dig him. As the 10th wide receiver in a dynasty startup, I don't love him that much, Marcus.
So this is where I struggle because I love Ladd as well. He's one of my favorite players in the league. And I was listening to another podcast, an Underdog podcast, talking about how Ladd stacks up compared to some of the other rookie receivers. And Hayden Winks made the argument that his tape was better than Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. from last year, including Marvin Harrison Jr. So there are tape watchers that believe, like, hey, this is a legitimately awesome player. And I tend to agree with that. But when we're talking about dynasty, you typically want the guys that can play inside, outside, that kind of have that size profile. Take a look at our top 3 or 4 receivers in dynasty leagues right now. Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb. Those guys are all over 6 foot. They're all over 205 pounds, right? They play outside, they play inside. Where I think Ladd, I think he could do a little bit on the outside, but he's purely a slot receiver, which, again, I have no problems with. But when we're talking about a top 10 dynasty receiver, I think I want somebody who has maybe a little bit more upside here. And that's where I would default to even someone like AJ Brown, who's older than Ladd. But I think AJ Brown's game is just going to continue to age well as he plays in this Philadelphia offense. I don't know if I would have him as low as wide receiver 17, but I think wide receiver 15-ish is where I get on board.
And so, I mean, we're on the same page, basically, 15, 17, a couple of spots. That's not that big of a difference. So again, I will not ever say anything bad about Ladd McConkey. He was one of the guys who made me look good last year in terms of my preseason predictions, and I love his game. I just don't think he's a top 10 dynasty startup wide receiver.
So I wanted to ask you about this because one of the biggest disagreements you have with Ladd is that, again, you have Ladd at wide receiver 17. His ADP is wide receiver 10. Garrett Wilson is wide receiver 14 in ADP, and you have Garrett Wilson at wide receiver 10. Funny enough, Ladd and Garrett Wilson are basically the exact same size. So why Garrett Wilson over Ladd, despite Ladd having the better quarterback, playing in better weather? What are your thoughts there?
If we learned anything from last season, having a average, mediocre, or above average quarterback does not necessarily mean that a wide receiver's fantasy stock is sunk. Hello, Malik Neighbors. Yep. Now, it certainly is an advantage to have a Justin Herbert type of quarterback, no doubt about that. But I just think Garrett Wilson has a higher ceiling than Ladd McConkey. And Wilson, over the last couple of years, has had some hurdles that he hasn't been able to clear, but he's still been a very good wide receiver, right? A few years ago, Rodgers went down and their quarterback situation was a disaster. And then last year, they brought in Devontae Adams, and then suddenly he wasn't the number one option in the passing game anymore. Now he is. He's still young. Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson played together at college, so there's somewhat of a built-in rapport there. And while the Jets are not a team I expect to throw the ball a ton, when they do, it's going to be going to Garrett Wilson a lot. I'm a big fan of him, and I would have him ranked ahead of Laddie Daddy all day long in dynasty leagues, in every league, to be quite honest.
Yeah. One last thing on Ladd, and this is where I think we need to try to figure out this offseason. I think the Chargers are going to want to try to run the ball even more this year. They went out and drafted Omari and Hampton in round 1. They signed Najee Harris. And frankly, I'm not a big Najee Harris fan, Fabs, but I think Najee is better than what they had at running back last year. So that room just got a complete transformation in one offseason. I think the Chargers are going to throw the ball even less than they did last year. The question is how big of the passing game pie is Ladd McConkey going to get? If he's getting 30-35% of the targets, I don't think we need to worry about this. But if they're just throwing the ball less and he's only getting 25% of the targets, then I get a little concerned about his fantasy value.
And also keep in mind, and I'm not saying that Mike Williams is the same Mike Williams from a few years ago, but every little piece of the pie that could potentially get chipped away will affect McConkey. I mentioned Trey Harris.
I like Trey Harris, by the way. I think he's going to be better than Josh Palmer.
I do too. We meant Quentin Johnson. I mean, not going to give him completely, but he's going to get some targets. Will Dissly is still there. They brought in Tyler Conklin. And as you mentioned, with Omari and Hampton, there's probably going to be more of a focus on the ground game. And that's always been what Greg Roman wants to do. Run the ball, run the ball, run the ball. So you're right on board. And I mean, that's also in line with my thinking and not having Laddie as a top 10 wide receiver.
We should also mention that Ladd didn't miss a lot of time last year with injuries, but if you watch the games, there were a lot of times where he left the field because he was banged up. He's just a small receiver. And this happened a lot of Georgia where his overall snaps were way down because he struggles to stay on the field. We're knocking on wood that he's able to stay on the field this year. We want to see all of these guys have awesome seasons. So let's hope that we're wrong about Ladd McConkey. Let's talk about the Chiefs receivers, because this is one of I think how you view these guys could determine your overall strategy, not only in startup drafts, but also in dynasty drafts. Let's get to Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout player, there has never been a better time to get in on the action. And FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player performance trends, same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. You guys know that I'm taking the Oklahoma City Thunder to win the NBA championship. I've been on them all season long, including through the postseason. I wouldn't be surprised if they sweep this series, so go check out those odds over on FanDuel. And if you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head over to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. And if it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets and make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are discussing some of the biggest, what do you want to call it, disagreements in ADP between Fabs and Dynasty League football. And let's go over to the Chiefs receivers, because this is a really interesting one. You have Rashee Rice at wide receiver 20, Xavier Worthy at wide receiver 24. Over on Dynasty League football, Rashee Rice, wide receiver 19. So you're in lockstep there. But Xavier Worthy, wide receiver 17, a top 30 overall player. How do you view these Chiefs receivers?
For me, it's too high on Xavier Worthy. And you mentioned Rashee Rice. Like, do we not remember this guy was amazing before? And I know it was a small sample size, but in the first 3 weeks of last year, he was a wide receiver 2. And he saw 34% of the team targets. During that time, Worthy only saw 13%. And then, of course, Rice got hurt. Are people worried about his return from the knee injury? Possibly. Are people concerned about maybe some discipline from the NFL after he was an idiot a couple of years back? Possibly. There's no question about that. But let's look in terms of the long game, right? I mean, Xavier Worthy, to me, is the number 2 wide receiver in Kansas City, where Rashee Rice is number 1. Rashee Rice is also a very young player. And while Worthy was really good in the second half of last year, and he was a star in the playoffs, there's no doubt about that, he doesn't have a clear path to being the number 1. I think Rashee Rice is the number 1. And then you also have to keep in mind for this year, right? Hollywood Brown is back. They drafted Jalen Royals, and you've also got Travis Kelce, who's past his prime, but still going to get plenty of targets. So I find it hard to believe that Xavier Worthy will be a mid-wide receiver 2 from a fantasy perspective, as long as Rashee Rice is on that roster. The Chiefs are not this highfalutin throwing the football a ton where Patrick Mahomes is putting up 50 touchdowns anymore. Mm-hmm. It's just not the offense anymore. And although they still throw the ball quite a bit, I think it was about 61%, I want to say, last season on the offensive side. I could be wrong there, but they still threw the ball quite a bit. I just think, and the Chiefs are also building, right? I mean, you're never going to stop adding weapons. So Royals is maybe the first step in that. Maybe they go a little bit. This could end up being a Rice, Worthy, Jalen Royals top 3 long term at the wide receiver position. I like Worthy. He's explosive. I think people see him as maybe Tyreek Hill 2.0. I'd still rather have Rashee Rice.
So I struggle with this in Fabs because, first of all, these are 2 of my favorite players in the league. They were some of my favorite receivers coming out of college. So this is like picking between my kids. So let's start with Rashee Rice. So I think when both players are on the field, I tend to agree with you. I think Rashee Rice is the guy that you want to have. Over his last 9 full games, 7.5 receptions, 90 receiving yards, 0.6 touchdowns. I mean, those are wide receiver 1 numbers, and those are like high-end wide receiver 1 numbers. So I agree with you there. I think the only thing holding me back from going all in on Rashee Rice is, well, an injury. That's obviously never a good thing. He's going to be suspended at some point. I don't think it's going to be this year from everything I've been reading. It looks like it's going to be probably 2026. And again, you're maybe looking at a 4 to 6 game suspension. It's not that big of a deal in Dynasty League. Right. Well, what I care more about, Fabs, is there's a knuckleheadedness factor. I don't know if that's a real word, that is with Rashee Rice. Like, if you slip up one more time, that might be the last chance that he gets, right? And that always, you have to factor that in. I want both of these receivers on my team because I think there is a chance with Travis Kelce getting phased out that maybe the Chiefs just dump 60% of their passing game into these 2 receivers, and that's just the offense moving forward. But at this point, I'd rather just take whoever's cheaper between the 2 of them. Yeah,
I agree there too. And don't forget, Xavier Worthy isn't exactly innocent off the field. He's had some stuff going on as well. Right. Not to the degree of Rashee Rice, certainly.
No, but, like legal. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So they're close. As I said, both players are very talented. Just to me, Rice fits the alpha definition more than Worthy, at least.
Well,
in my
because you could
opinion.
see Rashee Rice averaging like double-digit targets every game that he plays, right? Where I
Yeah.
don't see that being the case for Xavier
Yeah.
Worthy, and that's just going to make him more inconsistent week over week.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. And no doubt about that. And also, keep in mind too that when Worthy and Rice were on the field for those first 3 games last year, Worthy had 11 targets combined. Now, I get it, small sample size,
Scored some
but
touchdowns in there, which are always a little fluky. But
Rashee Rice was the guy.
He was the guy.
Rashee Rice was the guy, and also Hollywood Brown wasn't around either.
Yep.
So you factor that in, and I get it. Listen, Hollywood Brown, we liked him a few years ago in Baltimore. He's sort of fallen off a cliff a little bit here from a fantasy perspective because of the injuries. But I mean, he's still going to get his targets too. So
when he's on the field.
We've talked about this. The Chiefs have maybe the deepest group of receivers in terms of wide receiver, and then of course Travis Kelce on the tight end side. That maybe in Mahomes' entire career that they've ever had.
Yeah, I wanted real quick. I wanted to compare Xavier Worthy to a receiver. I don't think he's Tyreek Hill because Tyreek Hill was much more muscle bound, and I just think he was a little bit more dynamic with the ball in his hands.
Mm-hmm.
Worthy actually reminds me of another Andy Reid receiver, Deshaun Jackson, who tormented our Cowboys for a while. That sub 5'11" receiver who is 165 pounds, but is so fast that if he gets open down the field, there's nothing you can do about it. I kind of doubt that Xavier Worthy's game is going to grow a bunch as he gets older. I think this is probably just what he is. That's still an awesome player, but I think Rice is the guy that profiles as the one that's going to get 140, 150 targets every season.
So he would, right?
He stays healthy.
So he would be more of the Jeremy Maclin type, right? In that,
sure.
And also keep in mind, I mean, you mentioned Deshaun Jackson. I think that's a good comparison, but Deshaun Jackson was not a consistent fantasy wide receiver at all. He would have big games. He's had a few really good seasons, and then there's some seasons where he was dinged and his stats dropped off. And I can see the same sort of path with Worthy.
Yeah, I just don't think if you're paying wide receiver 17 prices, you're viewing him as a mid-range wide receiver 2. In fact, probably a high-end wide receiver 2. It's just a little too inconsistent for me. I would rather have, some of the receivers in that range for you are like Devontae Smith, Ladd McConkey, who we just talked about, Rashee Rice, Zay Flowers. I think I would just prefer all of those guys over Xavier Worthy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm right there with you, my friend.
All right, let's talk about the Packers receivers because that's one of the most challenging wide receiver rooms to figure out. We've been trying to do it over the last couple of years with absolutely no luck. But Fabs is going to tell you who is the best value of that bunch next. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen today. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Scouting Show. As training camps get closer and moves are being made, hosts Kyle Krabs and Joe Marino will make you the most informed NFL fan this offseason. Find Locked On NFL Scouting on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Fabs, let's talk about the Packers receivers. I want to start with Jaden Reed, who you have as wide receiver 36, whereas on Dynasty League Football, he's all the way down to wide receiver 47. At one point last year, going into the year, he was a top 24 receiver, down to wide receiver 47. Is Jaden Reed a good value in Dynasty Leagues right now?
I think he's a very good value. I have a soft spot for Jaden Reed. I got to be honest with you. I loved him coming out of college. And to start last season, it looked like he was going to break out, and he was one of my favorite breakout players. And then remember, the Packers just went so run heavy with Josh Jacobs that none of their wide receivers were very consistent. But let's talk about the long game, because that's what Dynasty is all about. Remember, earlier in the offseason, the Packers drafted 2 wide receivers. Matthew Golden obviously was the headliner, the big name, the speedster, and then Savion Williams. And then a report came out after that where Brian Gutekunst ended up going and meeting with Drew Rosenhaus, and Drew Rosenhaus is Jaden Reed's agent, and they wanted to clarify, what's Reed's status on this roster, and the team said that these additions will not affect Reed's status as its top receiver. Now, he's not an alpha type of guy, right? He's not Devontae Adams. He's not Jordy
No.
Nelson. He's a different type of guy. But at least based on what the team is saying, he's still going to be the number one receiver. And also, once again, long game. Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, both free agents after this year. Bo Melton, free agent after this year. Malik Heath, free agent after this year. So we could be looking at a long game where Golden, Williams, and Jaden Reed are the top 3 wide receivers in Green Bay. And one thing that's not going to change is that Reed is going to be one of those guys. And if we believe what the Packers are saying and what they talked to Rosenhaus about, Reed's still going to be the guy this year. He's 25 years old. He's under contract until 2027. I mean, maybe he'll have a third-year breakout. I mean, Marcus, you remember back in the day when, rookie wide receivers typically didn't come in and make an impact.
Yes.
And even in their second year, some did, some didn't. It was that third year where they busted out. Now, I'm not saying that Reed's going to bust out and be elite because there's just too many mouths to feed. But I do think that he's going to be a wide receiver 3 flex type. And that's why I have him ranked. I mean, that's at the end of the wide receiver 3s at 36 for me. Whereas on Dynasty, you've got wide receiver 47.
47.
Now, people are going to say, well, Matthew Golden, is a high draft pick and this guy's a speedster. Okay, I get it. Speed is great and all, but I'm not convinced that Matthew Golden's going to come into the league and light it on fire. I don't think he's an alpha. I think he's a guy who they're going to utilize to stretch defenses, to try and hit home runs. They didn't have that guy last year. He is not, Ted McMillan. I just don't see it. And so I still believe at the end of the day, and I do, again, I have a soft spot for Jaden Reed. At the end of the day, I still think he's going to be the most targeted wide receiver in Green Bay this year and into the future.
So let's get to some of the other rankings, because you have Matthew Golden at wide receiver 38, a couple spots behind Reed. Mm-hmm. Whereas on Dynasty League Football, wide receiver 32. So that's a big gap. Wide receiver 32 for Matthew Golden, wide receiver 47 for Jaden Reed. Apparently, Dynasty drafters are just convinced that the draft capital matters so much here when you draft a receiver in round 1. I don't think as talents, they're all that different. In fact, I think Jaden Reed's role on the offense is pretty solid. Like, he's the slot receiver. He's going to be the one getting some of these manufactured touches. Mm-hmm. I tend to agree with you. But I did want to ask you this, Fabs, before we head out. Mm-hmm. I kind of think Dontavian Wicks is the best value at this receiver core. And here's why. You have Dontavian Wicks, wide receiver 79. Over on Dynasty League Football, I think he's wide receiver 90. If you look at like some of the advanced stats from last year, like the open score that ESPN has, or PFF's, separation percentage, he's one of the best in the league. You look at how well he does after the catch, one of the best in the league. So you get open and you're great after the catch. The only problem with Wicks is there's obviously some drops issues, but there's been plenty of receivers who have struggled with drop issues, and they figure it out and they go on to have really good careers. I don't know if it's going to happen for Wicks in Green Bay because they have so many other receivers, but I just think he's a good player that I want to stash, on the bottom of my roster.
I was kind of in that boat last year where I was trying to get him late, and there were certainly flashes of potential, but he just burned out statistically down the stretch. And he was kind of, there was one point where, if you remember, the Packers wide receiver group had some injuries, and everyone in the industry was on Dontavian Wicks to have a good game, and he didn't. And so I think that kind of soured a lot of people on it. And then the stats never really bounced back. So maybe on another roster someplace, as you mentioned, maybe it's not in Green Bay, he could pop. But right now, he's maybe at best, Marcus, the third or fourth best option?
Probably, although
maybe the fifth best option. Right?
Here's the thing for me. I think Savion Williams, who they drafted in the 3rd round, he's so far away from being ready as a receiver. I think he's Cordero Patterson, like early career Cordero Patterson, who's just going to be a special teams guy. So then Wicks has to beat out Christian Watson, who is coming off a torn ACL, and Romeo Doubs, who might get traded to the Steelers this offseason once Aaron Rodgers finally signs. I just believe in the talent.
Look at you projecting. I like that.
Yeah. I believe in the talent. I want to have Wicks on my roster because whether it works out in Green Bay or somebody else, I do think he's going to become a starter somewhere.
And that is some, definitely future type thinking that you want to have when you're in a dynasty league. And so even though players change teams now more than they ever did before. I mean, I remember a time when there was never trades in the NFL, ever. It never happened. And then, you had the Clinton Portis Champ Bailey trade, and then it started to slowly change a little bit. And now forget about it. You got trades all the time, which is a lot of fun for us as fantasy fans.
I remember being really excited about Antonio Bryant for Quincy Morgan trade that happened like in 2003. Although I was mad because I wanted the Cowboys to keep Antonio Bryant. But you're right. Like there was a time where trades like that, kind of inconsequential, wide receiver trades, were huge deals. Not so much anymore. We see guys get moved all the time.
Antonio Bryant is the one guy who wore 88 for the Cowboys that wasn't really.
Come on, 2002 season was special. That's for a Locked On Cowboys show. Don't you worry, we'll get there sometime this offseason. But that's it for today's show. We'd like to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Check out the channel on YouTube. Download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Fabs on Twitter at Michael_Fabiano. I'm at Marcus_Mosher. On tomorrow's show, we'll take a look at the tight ends who Fabs has ranked higher than ADP. Make sure you guys tune in for that.